Well, hello again. It is time for our Liberty Alert Live. The Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty coming to you, talking about the issues of the day and talking about how important they are to you for the sake of your practice of faith in the public square. We're here to defend religious liberty and also share with you how to practice it, defend the sanctity of life, defend the institution of marriage as an idea that actually humanizes us and civilizes us in society, and also educational freedom. I'm Gregory Seltz, the Executive Director of the LCRL. I'm glad to be here with you again today. Our theme for today is free to serve. It's time. Its time has come. It's time to get to work. It's time to get back after things in a more normal fashion, and we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. It's time to protect our liberty for the sake of our service. Yes, based on the scientific data, there's no problem with that. But again, the reality is there's to how to deal with scientific and data in general. We'll talk about that today. It's time to realize that this thing about being free to serve is a conscience level compulsion, not a state-ordered compulsion. So we don't wait for the state ever to really tell us what to do. We always try to be faithful to God in service to our neighbor. And so we're not waiting for their permission to get back after things. We want them to lead us well. We want them to do what they're supposed to do. And we even suspended our liberties for a time in honor of that. But we're not waiting for them to tell us how to do things going forward, as you can see some of the abuses that are out there. And it's time to demonstrate what it means to be free to be faithful and to be free to serve. And so we're going to talk about how this is our faith motivating us not just to have worship services, but to be God's people in the middle of crises like this. Because I hate to tell you, but I've been in D.C. 3 years now, and it seems like there's a crisis all the time. A lot of it's been manufactured. And those crises are often used to do things to us, to make us do things. And I think we have to put our critical thinking mind, our caps on, and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And what is the best way to respond to this? And I think we have a very level-headed way of responding that I think blesses even those who disagree with us oftentimes. So we're going to talk about how to put that to work today. Before we get going, I just want to also tell you why, the Lutheran Church, or the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, is in D.C. for you, for the sake of you, your churches, your schools, the universities, your preschools, as well as you as a Christian who's trying to just live out their life in the public square. We are a standalone entity. We're not in anybody's budget. We're actually there for the sake of the church. And sometimes people say, well, where is the stuff that you're doing for us? And I want to tell you right off the bat, we had a COVID-19 response paper March 31st. Do you remember that? Some of you who were with me all the way back, this is our 8th live Liberty Alert. We had a COVID-19 response already back then. And if you remember some of the things, the first thing we said is, in all this, God is in control. We talked about how we don't do anything out of fear. We talked about that. The second one, we talked about how at that moment it was a crisis moment. We had really bad data, now that we look back on it, and that data was used to make us all very, very afraid. And so we were willing to even suspend our liberty for a moment for the sake of the safety of folks. But we also at that time said this: if medicine is fundamental, if food is fundamental, if love and relationships are fundamental, surely faith and worship of God remain most fundamental of all. We were saying that right off the bat. And we were saying this shutdown then must be reasonable and only for a time. And then we even had some guidelines what to do. Right now we said quarantine according to the guidelines and then be cognizant of the data. But always remember there's bigger issues than just the data. For a time, we were willing to change how we worshiped for a time. But then we also said already back on March 31st, be very watchful. Because times like this are often used by people who enjoy taking power and freedom away from you. They tend to use these things and hide behind these things. And we're seeing that right now. As I said, we're here to be an advocate for you in D.C. We're also here to be an educational resource for you. So right now, even on our website, we have some resources for you. Right now, we've got the COVID reopening church guidelines. So if you're wondering what states are doing things some ways, what states are doing things other ways, we've got that on our website for you. And right now, there's 9 states that are really going after the church. They're the kind of pinkish red hue. Minnesota just kind of, I think it went more to yellow over the week, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we've got that resource for you there. We also had last week the COVID-19 reopening resource, and this was a Alliance Defending Freedom resource. So it's not so much a how to open your church, but what are the legal ramifications and protections of doing that. So that was a great resource. And this week, we've got the interim guidance for communities of faith from the CDC. Again, you can look through this and you can start to plan how you're going to do what you're going to do as you reopen your congregation for the sake of the ministry to the culture in which we live. So all that's there. And I go through lots and lots of articles every day. I go through lots and lots of resources every day. And I try to kind of pick through it and say which are the ones that will be most helpful to our people. And those things will be on our website. Our website's lcrlfreedom.org. There's still a bit of a confusion out there. The LCMS launched our ministry, okay? But we're a standalone agency. We're not in anybody's budget. And so you might go to the LCMS, LCRL Freedom website, and it talks about us. But that was the kind of generic thing that launched us. This is the main website of our ministry and of our work in DC, and there's lots of information there for you already. So if you just go there, you will find all that information there as well. Also, we've posted all the live Liberty alerts. All the videos are there, but we've also posted many of the early PowerPoints, because there was a lot of information on those PowerPoints, how-to type of stuff. So if you want to go back and revisit those things, use those things at your church, they're all there for you. We can't do this without you. This is a special ministry. Its time has come. We need to actually push back on some of these governmental abuses so we can do our ministry in the places where we serve. We need your prayers. We need your support. We need you to be a part of this. But one of the things you can do is share this website. Use this website. Go to this, because there's a lot of resources that are there just for you. So again, that's what we're going to be up to today. We're talking about free to serve. That it's time. It's time for that. Its time has come. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, too, as I look back on some of the issues that are going on, one is what's happening in Minnesota with our Lutheran churches. What's also happening in Illinois and in Idaho. Some good news in two of those places. We are seeing that some of our suggested protocols have been followed. We talked about begin to fashion your plan. In fact, there's a question we'll talk about later dealing with this. But begin to fashion your plan as a congregation. Talk to your pastors, your elders, your council. Put together your plan for reopening. And then we said, run that by your circuit. Now, in the Lutheran Church, we have a circuit of churches close to home, and then we have a district of churches. And so we talked about run it by the circuit, run it by your district and your district president, and make sure that you get their wisdom and their guidance and their support. Then we talked about contacting your local authorities and laying out what you're going to be doing and how you're following the guidelines, the constitutional guidelines, maybe not necessarily the individual guidelines of that particular situation, but why you're doing what you're doing. And then as you reopen, if you find people that are using and weaponizing politics or weaponizing this virus situation to close you down, then have your district president, circuit, give us a call. We'll try to connect you with people like the Alliance Defending Freedom or the Beckett Fund or the Liberty Institute to see if there's a way we can marshal our forces and respond. So we're very thankful that some of the things that have been laid out are being utilized. Churches are utilizing these things with information, and some good things are happening. All right, before we get into the actual specifics of the day, I want to step back a little bit because, again, I want to say what makes us unique as a church and as a church entity in DC is that we have a faith-motivated engagement strategy. Yeah, we know we need to be engaged in the public square for the sake of the community and for the sake of the church, but it's still motivated by faith. We're not asking anyone to legislate our faith, but our faith motivates us to get involved in these moral issues of the day for the sake of the culture and for the sake of our proclamation. And right now, I'm telling you, we have a different attitude. We have an attitude of hope amidst the fear. We have an attitude of joy in service to even people who disagree with us. We have an attitude that tries to put the best construction on everything with people who disagree with us, because we know God can actually work with our dialogue to keep our place safe and civil. So we have this different attitude. And Bob Tasler, he's got his own website. I think it's Bob, Tasler, Tasler.com. He had a devotion I think it was a couple days ago or a couple weeks ago. I just picked it up, and it was called, Do You Have Enough? And so I'm just going to read a couple things, because this is the attitude that we have as we kind of go forward with these issues. Do you have enough in life? And remember, there's this verse in Scripture where Philip says to Jesus, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And Jesus says what? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And basically he's saying, you got enough. So this is the illustration he used. He said, an elderly mother and her daughter were saying a tearful goodbye at the airport. And the mother said, I love you and I wish you enough. On the airplane, the person who had overheard them talking said, what did you mean by that? And she said this, I wish you enough. She said, we talk about wanting our loved ones to have just enough to sustain them in this life. She said, I wish you enough sun to keep your attitude bright, enough rain to appreciate the sun more. I wish you enough happiness to keep your spirit alive. I wish you enough pain so small joys in life will appear larger. I wish you enough gain to satisfy your wanting. I wish you enough loss to appreciate all that you possess. I wish you enough hellos so that you get through the final goodbyes. And then Pastor Tasler said this, when he married people, he gave them this blessing. Lord, give them enough joys to keep them hopeful, enough trials to keep them faithful, enough happiness for daily joy, enough sorrow for daily trust. Give them enough strength for persistence and enough tears for tenderness. Wow. Well, we have more than enough. We have grace, mercy, and we have wisdom from our Lord, and it's especially important for this time. Okay, so it's time. It's time to get out of our houses. It's time to get back to work, to do things in a reasonable fashion. It's time to get back to worship. Like I said, we talked about the CDC guidelines that are out there. There's no reason why churches shouldn't be able to put these guidelines to work in their midst. Because the biggest issue I think we're fighting right now is there are still people who are utilizing this crisis to demonstrate how the church is not essential. Now, folks, we're going to finally have to make that decision. Is the church essential or not? I mean, the Constitution actually says the church, the religious liberty and exercise of the people of this country is essential. That's the First Amendment. Well, someone's got to still defend that, and that it's providing protections for us, but there are people who would love to see that change. They would love to see the church, silenced or pushed out of the public square. We were fashioned to be God's people in the midst of all this. So the last thing we want to do is run away from the challenges. So we want to get back to worship. And there are CDC guidelines that will help us to do that. There's Alliance Defending Freedom guidelines that will help us to do that. But again, the question is, why do you want to do it? Because we're in ministry. We're in ministry not just for the sake of our people. This isn't just a worship issue. This is a ministry issue, especially now. So we talked about the ongoing, the temporary shutdown. We were willing to do that. That we were giving up our right to do that for the sake of our culture. Well, now it's time for the church to demonstrate how to open back up too without fear. And that's what this is all about. I think, being Christian is a contact sport properly understood. I mean, you can't, I don't have any problem with the digital aspects of what we're doing in church. I was a radio guy. I was on the radio. My point was always still to drive people back to each other in church. As much as we love the internet, and there's an article that just came out that said people aren't tuning in at the same levels that they were going to church. So that's not a good sign, because once church becomes one or two issues away, it becomes easier and easier to become 3 or 4. And that's something that is not a healthy thing. That's why gathering together is so vital. But this isn't either or. It's not either worship face to face, or it's both and there is a priority ultimately to gathering together around word and sacrament. So again, put both of those things to work, but don't let someone redefine us because of this crisis. You know, people have sent me stuff about Luther in the pandemic, Luther in the plague, and Luther said very sincerely, he said, you know, if you have the faith to stay in the middle of this and even die with the people you're serving, do it. If people are too scared to do that and they leave, don't judge them. The point is that, you know, when you are confronted by something like this, let the bigger motivation of faith and wisdom in Christ motivate you. And a lot of people, I think they're afraid of what this could mean, that they're afraid of the fact they could die today. Well, we need to be there with the gospel message, especially at that moment. One of the biggest things that really bothered me is nobody was talking about how pastors and even believers were first responders too. And I don't see why. I mean, if I'm a pastor if my mom or dad, or even if my parishioners are in the hospital with COVID-19, I don't see why the last thing they say or last thing they hear should be, well, we can't do anything more for them. Because that's all the doctor can say. I've got a quote coming up in just a minute from a movie that kind of says the same thing. But I want them to hear more than that. But that's all the doctor can say. And that's why if the nurse can put this on and the doctor can put something on and the gloves on, then I can do the same thing, or you can do the same thing, to be there to read the scripture to them and pray with them and to share Christ with them. And if you have to go into a 14-day quarantine after that, so be it. You know, but again, to say, well, they're not that important. Well, in war, we send medics and chaplains because they're both essential. Well, this is not war. And so, you know, that's what we're fighting for in a lot of these things. So the real fight is, why can't I visit? Why can't we follow the same protocols and be that essential element of our society at this point? It's because there are people who don't believe that is something that is necessary. The movie I was talking about, The Edge of Darkness, and it was this guy named Jedberg, and he was dying of something, and he's kind of a big figure in the movie. But he looks at the doctor, and he says, when the doctor's looking in his eyes, he says, do you see a soul in there? And he goes, you know, basically, that's not what I do. And then the doctor says, you know, how you doing? Are you sleeping? He goes, I'm not sleeping. I start to sleep. I jolt awake. There's something about the darkness. He said, I don't like it. Now here's what the doctor said. I'm not a counselor. I know you want to banter with me. I don't do that. I only give you the facts. I give you the facts. And to that, Jedberg says, we all know what the facts are. We live a little while and then we die sooner than we planned. Well, there's more to be said at that moment. So again, that's the real fight. That's what we're up against. So see that CDC document. But also, we're going to post a letter from the Minnesota pastors, the Lutheran pastors, as they engage their governor. And there's just a couple things I want to share with you from their letter that I think will be helpful if you're kind of trying to fashion what to do. First, in this letter, they said to the governor, throughout the crisis, we've attempted to model Christ's love among our communities. That's why it was very difficult for us to suspend our essential services. But we did. In the decision making, we also sought to respect the authority of the civil government. That's a biblical principle. But now we believe we're capable, with the information we have, to open up and to maintain safe practices, making it unnecessary to further delay our meeting together. And then they pointed out it's permissible now for an unspecified number of people to go to shopping malls or enter stores as long as more than 50% of the occupancy is reached. There is no state mandate for anyone to wear masks in these stores or wash their hands or follow any specific protocol. But we don't believe then that forbidding us to gather with only 10 people or less is good, is right. And so then they talked about their plan. Their plan was to actually only, instead of 50%, they were going to try to keep it at 1/3 seating capacity. They're going to talk about having protocols for cleaning the church after every worship service, and they're going to even have protocols on how to seat people, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, we are going to open up no matter what. And that was a big debate that was happening last week. I think the governor did change his mind. Yes, I heard that, but I also have been in contact with some of the people involved. Fred Hintz is really involved with that in Minnesota. And he said to me, well, there's already rumblings that there's some other entities trying to figure out ways of bringing that hardened lockdown in a smaller arena. like the cities of some of these places. Like, look what's going on in Chicago. That's crazy. The Chicago mayor is threatening the church. She sent 5 police cars to an African-American church on the south side, and they were ticketing all the parishioners, all the cars around the church, and then they were trying to enter into that church to either execute a summons or an arrest, and the church locked the door because they said they usually do to keep gang violence out, from Sunday worship. And they were going to take them in, and someone said, "Where are we living? Is this Russia? Is this is this the Stasi from East Germany? What's going on here?" And she is continuing that kind of bullying, if you will, or that kind of tyrannical perspective, in spite of the fact that the data doesn't say so. And that's what I want to talk about next. It's time. Why is it time? Why? Because the virus isn't as virulent as first believed. That's what the CDC is now saying. The fact that the numbers are coming in now 0.01%, it's a little more potent. It's still potent. And there are people that are dying. There's no doubt about that. But it's about as potent as a really, really nasty flu. And the flu kills a lot of people every year, sometimes up to 60,000 people. But I know this is still a big number. But the point is we never locked the whole country down over something that was 99% survivable. And that's the number. We now know that the number, the people most at risk are people over 60 who have high blood pressure, heart problems, things like that. I might be in one of those categories, in the next couple years. But we can isolate and protect our most vulnerable while not quarantining the rest of the country. It seems like this is a protocol that a lot of politicians love. They actually tend to punish the good people or the healthy people so that they can take care of all of it. And usually that's the wrong way to go at it. The best thing to do is to protect those who are most vulnerable. And I know all of us have that perspective. We want to protect those who are truly at risk for this. That's why my biggest question is, why didn't New York lock down and protect people in the nursing homes? Why didn't they do that? And they didn't. And a lot of people died. I think the number is like 42% of all deaths are nursing home deaths. Well, why were they doing that up till just a week ago? Why didn't they wash the subways right away? You got to ask them, not me. But here's one that's really bugging me. There was in Michigan, there's a 20-year-old COVID patient who was, and now you've seen that terrible video where he's literally beating up a guy who's bedridden, a war veteran and he's just punching him in the face. Well, the guy had COVID-19. And so he's spreading that, as well as spreading the violence. I don't know why he's doing what he's doing. I hope he's been arrested. But the point is again, where are the guidelines there? They should have been incredibly strict guidelines to protect our loved ones. And again, if my loved ones are in the middle of that, are you telling me I can't be there to protect them, to serve them, to care for them, even if I go through all the safety protocols you go through? So again, use common sense, hygiene, and the rest of the country needs to get back to work, because we're also destroying our capacity to deal with this 6 months from now, a year from now, or when another particular virus comes down the pipe, and there will be more. There's other things like herd immunity. Getting outside, we're finding out that actually, the virus is so less virulent outside than it is indoors. And so there are studies now that are saying that our lockdown orders may have made it worse. But what we do know is the lockdown orders really haven't done anything better than just practicing social hygiene. We know that now. That's the data. Okay? Because what I've been hearing a lot is we're following faith, not the data. That's just flat out wrong. What you need to understand is the people that are saying this, follow the data, these are also the people that are saying lock everything down, especially the church. Folks, they're using that as like a shibboleth, okay? And what I mean by that is it's kind of like it supposedly takes the place of an argument. If I just say follow the data, then you're supposed to keep your church locked down. No, because they're cherry picking data. And they're only applying certain data to the situation. And that's what I'm seeing more and more out there. Science, we've talked about this. Scientific data can only tell you so much. Remember, we talked about that several weeks ago. If you're driving down the street, the data says you're driving a certain miles per hour, 25. Well, is that the right miles per hour? Should you be going 55? Should you be going 65? Should you be going 35? It doesn't tell you whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. It just tells you that you're doing something. And the same thing with the data we have with this. But this data can also be manipulated, and this is not exactly pure data. These are models where people are putting in information. The original model said 2 million people would die. Now we're down to 0.01%. Which is basically the same factor as an aggressive flu. Well, why were those models wrong? And why did they create such fear when now that fear really seems to be overblown? Okay? So that scientific data stuff, there's a moral perspective that needs to deal with this data, because there's other issues involved in the stuff that's going on today. The shutdown, the moralness of shutting people and taking away their livelihoods. It's amazing to me that people aren't saying, wait a minute. We want to protect people's lives, but we also want to protect their livelihoods, and to shut everything down and say, well, you're on your own, and we'll hope to get you a check for a couple of $1,000s to take care of you for months. We don't want that. We don't want those things. We want to be able to work and take care of our own families. There's a judge, I saw this article, Judge McCaney, I think this was in Wisconsin. He in a ruling that he had that was dealing with one of these religious liberty cases, or actually a business that was trying to open, he said, since the inception of this insanity, the following rules and regulations have occurred. He said, I won't get COVID if I get an abortion. I will get COVID if I get a colonoscopy. Selling pot is essential, but selling goods and services at family-owned businesses is not. And then he goes, a family of 6 can pile into their car and drive to the lake without contracting COVID, but if they all get in the same boat, they will. We're told kids rarely contract the virus. Sunlight kills it, but summer youth programs and sports programs are canceled. 4 people can go to the golf course in a car, but they can't play in a foursome. If I go to Walmart, I won't get COVID, but if I go to church, I will. And murderers are released while small business owners are threatened with arrest. He said this is lunacy how we're applying these things. I think he's right on that. Then we have I was talking about the Chicago mayor who is literally threatening the churches if they decide to open with more than 10 people. And I just read this too. California is now, because the Ninth Circuit Court has ruled with the governor, and the Ninth Circuit Court always tends to rule in such a way that says, remember we talk about the Constitution and its protections. If it's not in the Constitution, it has to go back to the legislature. Well, what he's doing is unconstitutional, but the Ninth Circuit Court says, yeah, but it's a good cause. And so they've ruled in favor of the governor for the radical new shutdown orders for the church. And so the churches are now asking that the Supreme Court take this on for an emergency order to open on Pentecost Sunday. And we'll be watching that as well. But when you talk about this science stuff, let me just go back to, I read a great article, and I'll try to see if I can make the link something you can look at. And it's not an article that's pertaining to religious liberty per se, but the article's titled, Wait, How Much of the Ocean is Actually Fished? Now, I'm using this article to give you an idea of how science can be used properly or it can be manipulated. And what I'm saying is, when you start using scientific data to just drive fear, and then you eliminate other data that would mitigate that fear, it's time to say, wait a minute, that's a misuse of science. How much of the world's oceans are affected by fishing? And so that's what this whole article is about. And there was a study that was done that said, now here it comes, ready? 55% of the ocean is overfished. Now that's crazy. I mean, and if I read that headline to you, you would be like, oh my gosh, we have to do something radically right now. But some of the scientists who read that said, wait a minute, that just doesn't sound right. And here's what happened. They came up with a figure where it said 4% of the ocean is fished. Now, is it 55% or is it 4%? And which one is the truth? And which one causes you fear, where the other one says we need to do something, but it can be a reasoned approach and we can deal with this, that, or the other thing. Well, here's what happened. They quantified the ocean. The first study quantified the ocean by dividing it into a grid of 160,000 squares. They kind of used latitude, longitude squares. But each one of those squares was the size of Rhode Island. And if somebody fished at all in that little square, it could have been way over in the corner here, and that's it, then the whole square was counted as being fished. Now think about that for a minute. So if you went out in a boat on a lake in Rhode Island, they would count that the size of Rhode Island was being fished. Well, these guys said, no, that doesn't make much sense. And so they had the technology to actually divide the grids up in a lot smaller faces. And so what they did is they drove it down to a much smaller, much more accurate. So we could accurately see where the fishing was actually occurring, and then bring that percentage over the overall ocean. And by just changing their measurement and making it more refined, the actual number is 4%. And if you even refine it more, it's even less than that. So when you think about this, you think, wait a minute. Now, they make in the argument, this article, that overfishing is still a problem. And if you want to get into that debate, go right ahead. But do it with accurate data, and don't start driving fear to come up with solutions that are solutions for problems we don't have. And that's kind of where I think we are with a little be of this today. So our methodology, again, critically, and when I say critically, I'm not saying use your critical thinking skills. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about being a critic or being someone who just disagrees with somebody. No, I'm saying use your critical thinking, receive all the information you can receive, and then understand that the church is an essential part of the solutions that we need to deal with when facing our mortal fears, the issues of the day. Science is not going to solve those issues. It's going to come down to, what do you see in there, doc? And he's going to say, that's not my job. I just give you the facts. And we say, well, no, there's more to these facts than just your perspective on them. So that's kind of where we are. And then decide what faith and wisdom and mercy will motivate you to do, because we don't just protect our religious liberty rights, we also know that we have religious liberty responsibilities, and that's kind of what we've been talking about over the last few months. So there is government overreach out there, there's nefarious intervention, it isn't reasonable and it isn't warranted, so we have ways of pushing back on that. We're not going to let people take away our responsibility as well as our protection to serve others in Jesus' name. And we're going to open up with a different mindset. We're not just going to open up and make sure that we can go to the store and make sure that we can do this, that, or the other thing. And it's not just leisure and food and water. It's also, there's a spiritual dimension to life, and we're part of that discussion as well. And we're part of that discussion as we serve in the middle of these kinds of issues. This right of redress, there's a lot of people that say, yeah, but that's not what the church is about. Again, that's true. That's not what the church is about. That's not our main message. But remember, God works in the world two different ways, and we need to be faithful to both of the ways He works. He works in the world to preserve it, and that's the religious liberty protections, the First Amendment protections, the legal protections. Those are ways that God works through vocations, through man, husband, wife, mom, dad, magistrate, entrepreneur. All those things are ways God preserves the world. And we've got to be active in those ways too, because God has a moral dimension to those things operating properly. That's not our main message. Our main message is that God saves the world by grace through faith in Jesus. I get that. But we've got to be active in both for the sake of the culture and the church. And in this case, pushing back on government overreach, where they start to tell us what to do about the essential things in life. No, they don't have that. They don't have that right, but they also don't have that responsibility. And the LCRL is involved in these kinds of issues when it comes to education, who has the right to educate your kids, when it comes to who has the right to define marriage, when it comes to the right of the sanctity of life and what that means in our culture. We're fighting these kinds of battles all over the place so that you can keep proclaiming the whole truth, speak the truth of the Word of God without fear. So, again, this right of redress is something that is now happening. And our churches, when we get pushed to that level of these things, that's where our churches do shine. Because we don't get involved in a lot of the opinions of these things when they're good opinions on both sides. But when you get pushed to these fundamental issues, that's where the Lutheran Church does a very good job of standing. And we're not just standing for our sake, we're standing for the sake of everyone who needs these protections and needs to take on these responsibilities. So take responsibility for your action and get back to work, get back to trying to live your life in a normal fashion. There are still guidelines that will help, these mask guidelines, the hygiene guidelines, but we're not going to do anything out of fear. Okay, we talked about how the church blessed the community by willfully closing down, and now the church seeks to bless the community by willfully opening up, and we want to do that honoring our magistrates, but if they're overstepping their boundaries, we have a responsibility to push back on those things for all people too. So bring that message of hope into the middle of people's suffering and struggles, and that's what it's all about. Now, here's a couple of things to think about. Bring that message back into the middle of this. So we're not waiting for the government to tell us we can open back up just to do our thing. No, we want to bring this message back into the middle of all of this so that we can be a useful, helpful voice to everybody, not just to our own people. We want to demonstrate sensible public group activity in action. And the Minnesota DPs defined that. They could have done 50% right to the letter, but they did 33%. They want to show good faith and honor people's struggles because they don't want to overstate what's going on out there, but they also want to be of service. Some churches are just having more services, but then that's going to challenge cleaning protocols. But they've got ways of working that out. People know how to do these things. They don't need someone, from their desk making these decisions for them. In fact, that judge, one of the things he was most angry at is the people barking out these orders, and he said these are not laws. He said these are executive orders. These are royal decrees. He said, and most of them aren't living by the very decrees they make. And he said that's what kind of made him mad most of all. So, and now for the sake of the church and the community, we're going to open up and we're going to demonstrate how we do things. We're going to put the best on. By the way, the third thing is, so the first one is bring that message. The second one is, demonstrate sensible public group activity. The third one is put the best construction on everything. Oh my gosh, what I'm seeing over the country. The Eighth Commandment is one of the most broken commandments now in our modern age. I mean, we have television shows that just tell tattletales on each other. The Eighth Commandment is don't bear false witness against your neighbor. This is a deadly thing if you just do it without any restraint. And look what we're doing to each other. And so not only don't bear false witness, but put the best construction on people's activities. So if you see someone who doesn't have a mask on, don't run down there and kind of create an angry mob. 2 months ago, we were told masks didn't do anything for us. Now we're told, if you don't have a mask on, I'm going to die. No, that's not a healthy, sensible, reasoned way of thinking. If you've got a mask on, and when I go to the store, I put a mask on, I got gloves on, okay? That's probably more protection than I feel I need to take, but I take it because there's reasons for it, and I'll do it as long as I think it's necessary. But if I've got all that on, the chances of me getting sick by someone who doesn't have a mask on are nil, and especially if I just kind of avoid bumping into them, whatever. But this kind of like mob mentality now of pitchforks and bats and driving people out of stores, it's crazy. It really is. And so we're going to be the kind of people who don't look to rat out our neighbors. Now, if something's egregious, like someone's willfully not wearing a mask and trying to cough all over everybody, that's a different thing. But, again, civility, the Ten Commandments, if it does anything for us, it gives us a sense of civility. Even if it can't save us, it can protect us. God can preserve us when we honor the sanctity of life, when we honor marriage, when we will not steal, we will not covet, we will not bear false witness. This is the general thing that at least will keep us from becoming the worst human beings we can be for each other. And we will honor and respect our government even when we disagree. So we will pray for our governors even when they do these nefariously tyrannical things to us. We will still honor and pray for our mayor, but we will not let them take our liberties away. We can do both of those things. All we're saying is you stay in your lane. You stay in the lane that constitutionally has been given to you, and we will stay in the lane that God has actually put us in, and we will exercise our liberties in service, because that's the solution. Okay, so that's kind of, it's free to serve. This is not something we wait for someone to give us permission. We use all the information, we use the liberties we have, and we now open up because the data says that, and now's the time. And there's always been a needed message in the middle of this crisis that the doctors and the nurses cannot give because of the science of it. Now, if they're Christians, they can give it, but the message of a God who's in the middle of our suffering, a God who's in the middle of our struggle, a God who brings life when they're at the point of death, that is a message that really we can bring to people's lives. And I think we're called to do just that. All right, some of your questions again, so thanks again for sending some of those questions in. The first one comes from Jane, and Jane says, who should be aggressively leading the reopening of the churches? Paid staff, church council, congregants, and should we wait until the governor says we can do something? I think we've kind of hit on all that, but again, just the protocols we've talked about. We are the ones who have to decide how to be faithful to God in service to our neighbor. We're the ones, we use the scripture, we use the wisdom that we have that's coming in from the disease centers and all that. We put all that together and say, how can we serve one another? Like I said, I'm not sure that I would have been able to honor a lockdown order if someone I love, my wife, my daughter, my family, were suffering from COVID. The last thing that they're going to hear is we can't do anything for them. I'm going to find a way to honor whatever lockdown things are, but I'm going to get there so that the message of the gospel, even if it's outside the window, I mean, it's bizarre to me that people are so easily saying, well, we're just, if they tell us, here's grandpa and it's time for him to go away, we just let him take him. I don't know that I'm not sure I could ever have done something like that. But again, if that happened and you lost a loved one, just know that Christ is able to even work through some of the craziness of what's going on out there. But who should be leading this? Again, I would just say, talk to your fellow believers and try to talk to people around the council and the elders. I mean, they have spiritual authority and oversight, and the pastor, of course. But don't put it all on him. I mean, he's got to make a lot of hard decisions too, and he's probably going to lean on the leaders of the congregation. And then before you do anything, run it by other congregations in your area. That's why you have a circuit of churches and you have a circuit counselor. And then before you do anything, please let your district presidents know so that they're not caught unawares. Even, as I've said before, call your local police station, call the local authorities. Say, this is what we're going to do, and tell them why you think you can do it, because it honors the guidelines that are out there. And then plan for what you're going to do with public worship, and then even what you're going to do with ministry. So there's a lot of things that are going on here, but you guys can take that responsibility. The ADF guidelines will help you so that you're not overly afraid of what the government can do to you, because they really can't do certain things, even though they say they can. Look at the COVID-19 reopening things, the CDC stuff, and then put that to work. And if you do run into problems where they say you can't, then we're here as a resource for you as well. Although these resources are here for you even before it gets to that point, okay? So don't be afraid of this, and start to talk to those that are in your church, your leaders, and see where that discussion can go. And then the last question, Paul asked this. He said, can we come together with a list of ideas that support the question of what we can do now? And as I thought about that, I don't want to be the only one answering that, because we're a resource to you. We don't come up with all the solutions. We have ways of helping you with religious liberty, with sanctity of life protections, defending the institution of marriage, defending and advocating for educational freedom. But we don't have all the solutions to ministry practices that you can do that are unique to your neighborhoods or unique to your particular ministries. So I would love it if some of you would send me some of the ideas of what your churches are doing. Send me some of the ideas of some of the things that are happening where you're you're trying to honor the restraints, but you're trying to burst through those restraints in a positive way so that you can even demonstrate to the non-believing community how you can live a different way. You don't have to sit there and wait for people to tell you how to live, but that doesn't mean you live the way you want to. You're still living, trying to be obedient to God in service to neighbor. What a beautiful thing that we could start to model and do going forward. So, we try to talk about how to do this in other areas too. What does it mean to be a pro-life person? Well, there's certain ways we act about certain things that demonstrate that we live differently. Or if we believe in marriage, maybe we undergird marriages. We teach about the power of marriage and the positivity of marriage, even though it is limiting you to, the contract of staying together for your whole life with one person. We don't think that's a bad thing, but we'll demonstrate how to do that in a very joyful way. So there's other ways we do that with other issues. What about this COVID-19? What are some of the ways that you're opening up the church, you're opening up your ministries, and even if you run into this pushback of tyrannical decrees, how you're even dealing with that differently? You still might push back on it, you still might take your stand on it, but we take our stand even there differently than other folks. So see how, send me those things if you think about these over the next week, and I'll try to see if we can incorporate that into our discussion. Again, thank you very much. Please, if you can just share with people our website, lcrlfreedom.org. There's so much information there that you can go and put this to work right now. Also, if you want to get our mailer, you can text LCRL to 444-999, and we'll get you on that emailer where you get a devotion every Monday and an opinion piece about this kind of stuff every Friday. And if you are so moved, we sure could use your support, your prayers, obviously, in everything we do, because we're here to serve you. But there's even a button where you can donate to us too, so that we can be an enduring voice in DC just for you. God bless you. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next Wednesday for our next live Liberty Alert. I'm Gregory Seltz. Great to be with you. God be with you. Take care.